it's round 7. And Magnus Carlsen has now won 4 games in a row. And he's facing a strong Grandmaster, Alexander Zubov, who specializes in these quicker time controls. I believe he's Ukrainian, correct me if I'm wrong. But not someone to be, you know, messed around with. Carlsen has the black pieces, and yeah, he's now within striking distance of the top dogs. I believe at the time the top players had dropped half a point, so Magnus is 1.5 points behind, but you know, within striking distance. But let's dive into this game. Magnus has the black pieces. Game 2 of day 2, and let's see if Magnus is feeling it. After knight c3, we have bishop to b4. Slightly unusual move, and I would say a relatively modern trend. Now this could transpose in many cases into like a Ragozin, but sometimes this gets a very independent feel. Zubov goes for e3, knight to f6, and knight g to e2. So yeah, you're starting to resemble a Nimzo Indian here, a Nimzo Indian Rubinstein. We have c6, a3, and bishop to a5. With white having developed this knight here, he wants to take on c3 with a knight. So black is less inclined to take on c3. And also if it doesn't do that, then this knight on e2 is slightly in the way and has to move again to enable this bishop to develop. So this is indeed what happens. Castles, bishop to d3. And now black takes on c4, only after white has moved this bishop. So white has to spend 2 moves to take on c4. And this allows black to play e5, and this is very close to being an immediate equalization attempt. Zubov castled. If he takes, we can take. The knight is pinned, so we have to take with the king. And now knight g4, and black has no problems. Might even be better here after knight to g4. He will regain the pawn with absolutely no problems. So Zubov prefers castling. Knight b to d7, now protecting the e5 pawn. Bishop to a2. The bishop jumps back to c7 and d5. Carlsen takes, and I was slightly surprised by the choice to take with the bishop here. And that's indeed what Zubov does. But perhaps black doesn't really have a good way to save this bishop, so white isn't giving up the bishop here. I mean, this is too passive. If you go here, you get hit with b4, and here you can, yeah, you're immediately getting hit by this knight. So knight b6 was preferred by Magnus, and now Zubov gets rid of the bishop pair, takes on c7 and plays bishop to d2. The bishop wants to come to c3. Rook to d8, lining up against the queen. White attacks black's queen, queen to e7, and bishop to b4. So now we have forced trades. Rook takes d1, bishop takes e7. Rook comes back to d2, and white challenges the d file. So no time to take here because of the back rank. So now the trade, and bishop e6 covering the back rank. So now we have a relatively symmetrical pawn structure. Both sides have 4 pawns on the king side, and yeah, 2 on the queen side. We do have opposite colored bishops, but overall this will be really difficult to win. After knight e4, f6, enabling the king to come out. Knight c5, the king comes out to f7, hitting the bishop. Bishop to d6, and now knight to c4. We have trade of the b pawns and rook c1. So we're still having a symmetrical position, more or less. I mean, white can play f3, e4, and we have complete symmetry of the pawns. For now, Carlsen is blocking the c file. No rook to c7. And of course, you know, true to style, Carlsen will try to play for a win here, but the means to do so are very, very thin. It's very hard to make anything happen here for black. And white comes up with a good configuration of his pieces. Very similar to when you're mating with a bishop and a knight. You place them like this, the bishop is covering the knight, and they're covering different color complexes, so they're actually covering a lot of squares here and more or less dominating the black rook, which has a hard time coming into the game, as this is also covered by the white rook. So this inability to introduce the rook into the game makes it very easy for black. I know makes it very difficult for black to play for a win here. Rook a7, rook c5, hitting the pawn. Now a4. Okay, a more advanced pawn and a potential weakness here, but we do not have access to this c4 square at the moment. And white has a very nice piece configuration, so he just brings his king in. Knight to d3, rook c3, bishop to b3. And okay, we would like to attack this pawn, but again, it's very difficult. This knight doesn't have an easy route to attack it. And once again, this rook is a little bit out of the game. Knight c8, attacking the rook. Note that, of course, you can't take because of bishop to a2, and also, well, the bishop was hanging as well. Rook to a6, king comes into e2. Knight b2, the knight comes back to d6. And yeah, a little bit of back and forth here by Magnus. And perhaps he had to settle on a draw here. Perhaps play something like bishop to d1, king here, and if white wants a draw, he can just go back. But instead, Carlsen played rook to a7. And from here, things start to deteriorate rather quickly. Bishop d1, king to e3. The king goes back, and now f3. After the bishop goes back to b3, now f4. And all of a sudden, it's white who is taking over the initiative. He's attacking this pawn on e5. And note also that this pawn on h5 is a weakness that white can in some cases take advantage of. Now Carlsen starts to retreat, bishop to e6, takes. Okay, at the moment we have to keep an eye on the bishop, so we can't take here. King d2, bishop to g4, and knight to f7. And yeah, we see that the white pieces are just more active here. We already have 3 guys ganging up on this e5 pawn. White will be able to win it pretty quickly. After knight d1, knight g5 check. And white wins a pawn. At a quick glance, you can see that, you know, black just doesn't have the counterplay necessary for a pawn. And he's just in trouble here. Might actually be completely losing. Knight to f2, rook b5. Finally this rook gets into the game, but too little too late. The king is actually quite safe here on c3. And white is just ready to nurture the extra pawn. If black is not careful. This is a weakness as well. King to f8, rook b8, check. King e7, and now going for the g7 pawn. Carlsen goes for the counterplay, but he's actually just losing another pawn. Bishop d1. Rook takes g7, 3 pawns now. But white has to give up the a pawn, so 2 pawns. But the price of that is that the king is now relatively safe. And what's worse, the black king is now boxed in, almost in a mating net here. We have knight g4, bishop to d4, rook b5, king d6, starting to threaten some evil things, such as rook to g8 mate. So bishop g6 covers that, but rook a7, rook b8, and now knight to e6, and now we threaten another mate, rook to e7, with a knight covering these squares. So Carlsen has to take. But now white just has 2 extra pawns, and yeah, threatening another mate to add insult to injury. Everything covered, so Carlsen gives a check, but too little too late. This pawn will drop and black just doesn't have any activity. This knight is even dominated by this bishop. And Carlsen had to resign here, so a big blow to his comeback attempt here in the 7th round. So now he has to play huge catch up for the rest of the tournament if he wants to have any chance of winning it. Most likely, and in recent years, 11 points has usually been enough, and that basically means that in the remaining 8 rounds, Carlsen can probably only afford 1 loss or 2 draws to have a chance at winning. Can he do it? If anybody can, he can, but remains to be seen. See you in the next video. Bye bye.